Hi everyone. Today we are going to be looking at what we call the endocrine system. Okay, so basically, the endocrine system is a system that has to do with the understanding how some certain chemical substances are produced from the body, and they are produced from what we call the ductless glands. So these chemicals can be hormones or other different types of substances that can elicit a response in other type of cells. Okay, so we'll talk about the autocrine, we'll talk about the paracrine, and we'll also talk about the endocrine. So all these consist of a family, or we can discuss them under the topic known as the endocrine system. So that's what we are basically looking at right now. Okay, I'm sure this topic you have done it in high school, and it's a very simple topic, so it won't cause any challenges or difficulties. So basically, this video that I'm making is just talking about the overview of the endocrine system. This PowerPoint is not very detailed. Yeah, so I'm just trying to let you understand what the endocrine system is all about. So that's what you're going to talk about, the endocrine system, just an overview. All right, now this next slide is talking about the simple or basic anatomy, trying to show you where these glands are found on the human body. So as you can see, on this other side, we have got a human being, okay, a female, and there are structures which have been labeled. So these structures are not found on the outside, but they're found on the inside. Let's look at the text. So the endocrine glands have the systemic effects. So what do you mean by systemic effects? Meaning they are able to affect different systems. And as you know, a system is made up of different organs working together to achieve the same goal or common goal. So that's what makes up a system. So now, these endocrine glands are able to elicit that response, okay? Are able to effect that change. It might be either stimulation or it has to be inhibitory, but an effect has to be there. So they act on what we call specific targets or tissues, okay? So we can say specific target tissues in specific ways. So whenever this chemical reaches a target organ or a target tissue or a target cell, it's going to elicit a response. It's going to produce a response that is going to cause change, okay? May have single or multiple targets, all right? So it can either be only one target or multiple. For example, as we go on, we'll talk about insulin, glucagon, etc. So you talk about it's one of the most commonly talked about hormone under the endocrine system, and most of you know that it has to do with controlling the amount of sugar in the blood. So basically, you also look at that and understand what it means. Okay. Then, apart from talking about the effects and how these hormones are secreted, we also talk about these disorders involved. Okay, so when we talk about the disorders, we are not talking basically about physiology, but we're talking about pathology. And we talk about, in physiology, we call it pathophysiology. Okay, you talk about the normal and also the abnormal. Okay, what can happen when something is normal and what can happen when it is abnormal. Okay, so we'll talk about all those things. So there are many different types of disorders that we are going to look at. Okay, so now what you're seeing on this slide is just trying to show us the structure, the glands that we're going to talk about under the endocrine system. So now, basically, what you're seeing here is known as the hypothalamus, which contains also what we call the pituitary glands. So as you know, I said this is just an overview. So the pituitary gland has got two parts, which is known as the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, okay? So these secrete different types of hormones, all right? So you can mention one type of hormone produced by the anterior pituitary, and you can also mention another hormone produced by the posterior pituitary. For posterior, it's very common. Most people know that it's vasopressin, etc., etc. But there are also about several types of hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, which affect other type of glands or ductless glands. Okay, so it's able to control all those things. So we'll talk about that. Then when you go on the neck, gland, then we also have what we call the thymus. glands, okay, or others are called them as suprarenal glands, okay. They're made up of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. So we'll discuss about those later on in detail. So this video is just about introducing or just giving you an overview of what the endocrine system is all about. So now, what you're seeing there is known as the pancreas, okay? So the pancreas is also an organ which has got two functions, which is endocrine and exocrine. So when you say endocrine, it has to do with ductless glands. Then when you talk about exocrine, it has to do with glands that have got ducts. For example, those that produce digestive enzymes, okay? They are senile. So we'll talk about, I mean, you have learned that under GIT, but we can just mention them because we are looking at this same organ known as a pancreas. Then when you go down there, you're going to find that these are known as the gonads. So the gonads also produce different type of hormones. In females, we've got the ovaries, and the ovaries have got specialized type of cells that are able to produce these, okay? So we'll talk about example, where is estrogen produced, where is progesterone produced, etc., etc. And we have got the ovaries there, okay? So that's what this PowerPoint is all about. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So now again, what are endocrine hormones? So number one, chemical signals from one cell to remote target cells, okay? Chemical for direct cell to cell communication, which is also correct. Chemicals that cross a gap between adjacent cells, okay? So these also fall under what we call the endocrine system. So as long as these three processes are happening, to say chemical signals from one cell to remote target cells. So when they talk about that, they're just talking about endocrine hormones, because endocrine hormones have to move a long way as compared to other types of chemicals that are produced, which we'll be able to explain in detail later, okay? Now, let's talk about how these messenger molecules behave and how they are made up, what makes them up, okay? So now, messenger molecules, these are cells must communicate with one another to coordinate cell process within tissues and to maintain homeostasis, all right? So now, homeostasis, as you know, has to do with regulation or maintenance of a constant internal body environment, which is okay, all right? Yeah. Then cell-to-cell communication is carried out via what we call messenger molecules, which are a variety. Okay, so we'll talk about those as we go on. Let's go to the next slide. So now this is basically trying to show us, if you look at this part saying three types of chemical signals are used for cell-to-cell communication, a chemical diversity of vertebrate hormones. So now chemical type and examples. So these hormones fall in different categories. You are going to find that we have got what? The hormones that are made up of peptides and proteins, okay? Or synthesized from multiple amino acids. For example, we have got what we call oxytocin. So oxytocin is one of the protein hormones or peptide hormones. So this, don't pay attention to the biochemistry or the structure. It's not important in physiology for now. Yeah, unless maybe you're doing biochemistry. Then what you are seeing here is known as amino acid derivatives. So these are synthesized from one or two amino acids. An example is epinephrine, which is known as adrenaline. Okay, so that is known as an amino acid type of hormone. Then when you go down there, you're going to see, and actually even thyroxine is also part of amino acid derivatives or hormones. Then when you go down there, you're going to see that there's what we call steroids. So steroids are synthesized from what we call cholesterol. Okay, so an example of steroids are known as testosterone, estrogen, etc. So those can be known as steroid hormones. So basically, all these things that you're saying, steroid hormones, amino acid derivatives, all those are going to be looked at in endocrine system in detail. So this PowerPoint can just be more like an appetizer for an heavy meal or what. So that you just get interested in learning about the endocrine system. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide is just trying to say how cells are able to communicate. So there are different methods that cells can use to communicate, okay? So there's one, the direct method, there's synaptic, there's paracrine, endocrine, then there's also autocrine, which is not in this table. So if you can start with direct communication, just communication on top there, there's chemical messages, as you can see, communication, chemical messages, mechanism of transmission, and examples, all right? So now it's direct. So ions, small molecules can communicate via what we call direct method, okay? Yeah. Then what in terms of the mechanism of transmission? So direct movement through gap junctions, linking the cytoplasm of adjacent cells. Examples, there's also what we call ion flow between cardiac muscle cells, all right? Then under synaptic, as you know, synapse communicate via what we call a junction known as a synapse. So there is what we call neurotransmitters. An example is glutamate. Glutamate is used is used during it's used when you are it's used in vision. Okay, so there is when you look at the cones and the rod cells, the rods and the cone cells are able to empty glutamate when they are in the dark. But the moment any light is there, it suppresses the production of or the release of glutamate, which is also similar to how ACH or acetylcholine diffuses across a synaptic junction. After that, let's now look at what we call the paracrine. So the word para means between, okay? So meaning has to do with, there's a cell that is producing a certain chemical, then it crosses over to excite other cells, okay? So this does not require to move a long distance. It's just trying to excite the neighboring cells. So that's known as paracrine, and that's known as local hormones, okay? Yeah, so an example of this, we have got what we call prostaglandins, okay? Then there's also what we call the endocrine hormones. So endocrine hormones, as you can see on this diagram, it's showing a cell produces a certain substance known as a hormone, which is able to travel a long distance. Actually, it has to use the bloodstream. So talk about the endocrine hormones. They're supposed to use what we call the blood or the circulatory system to reach their target cells or target organs. So this is what happens, okay? Yeah, an example is insulin, okay? So now let's talk about the hypothalamus, right? Yeah, so now the hypothalamus, as you know, it is part of the brain. So now it's located deep within the cerebellum. So some cells relay messages from the autonomic nervous system to the central nervous system. Autonomic, just know, it has to do with, it's not, you don't control it consciously. It happens on its own. So cells relay messages from the autonomic nervous system to the central nervous system. Central consists of the brain and the spinal cord, okay? So other cells respond as gland cells to release hormones. So now, this table is just trying, when I say this as an overview, this table is trying to show us the different types of hormones produced by what we call so endocrine system, glands, hormone, target tissues, hormone, and effects. So now, what you're saying here is the hypothalamus and what is able to produce, okay? So the glands and hormones. So there's what we call growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, gonadotropic releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropic releasing hormone, and prolactin releasing hormone, and prolactin inhibiting hormone. So now if you look at the target tissues, these are anterior-pituitary, all these are being stimulated by anterior-pituitary. What do they do? Stimulate the release of growth hormones, suppresses the growth. So now if you look at all these, so there's gland and major hormone, target tissues and major hormones. Again, you'd find that all these other type of hormones that are being referred to as the hypothalamus type of releasing hormones, they are also referred to as part of the anterior-pituitary, which is able to release these hormones, which can go and elicit a response, as you can see on the other side. There's growth hormone, there's adrenocorticotropic hormone, there's thyroid stimulating hormone, there's luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, which go and stimulate the ovaries and etc. So all those things are able to be produced and go and affect other type of cells, right? So growth hormone, as you know, and the secretion causes gigantism. Then oversecretion causes dwarfism, right? Then adrenocorticotropic hormone, all these hormones are going to elicit a response in their target organs, right? So that's what we are going to be discussing in detail later. So now, the posterior pituitary. So now, posterior pituitary gland, known as antidiuretic hormone or ADH. The posterior pituitary gland is able to produce, as I said earlier, one of the most common type of hormones known as vasopressin or ADH, which is known as antidiuretic hormone, which stands for ADH. So where does it target? It targets the kidneys, all right? So in the kidneys, that's where we have what we call reabsorption of water from urine in the collecting tubules, all right? Yeah, so you'd find that we have got what we call aquaporins, and aquaporins are able to facilitate the absorption of water and stimulates increased reabsorption of water into the blood volume. Now, when you talk about oxytocin, the uterus and breasts of females and kidneys, that's their target. So oxytocin is produced, it goes to the uterus and breasts of females and kidneys. What's its function? It stimulates uterine contraction and reproduction. And that's true. You know, the more oxytocin you have in the blood as a female, the more the contraction of the uterus increase intensively. All right. Yeah. So if a person is pregnant and a doctor or a person gives that woman oxytocin, she can even undergo what we call forced labor. So we'll also discuss later on about diabetes insipidus and also talk about diabetes mellitus. Then oxytocin and pregnancy later on will be discussed in detail. So anterior pituitary. So now the anterior pituitary is also part of the pituitary. Like I said, there's anterior and posterior. So the first part we talked about the hypothalamus. Now we're talking about the anterior pituitary. So now the anterior pituitary gland produces these. We have got the growth hormone, which is GH. There's adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. There's also what we call the thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. There's also what we call the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. There's also what we call the luteinizing hormone, LH, and there's also what we call prolactin, PRL. Okay, so I always tell people to say there are about 6 major hormones produced by the anterior pituitary glands, but there are also other small quantities that are produced, which we'll discuss later in detail. So all these cells, you look at it at the middle, is talking about the target organ. So growth hormone targets all cells, especially growth cells. Then the adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex, while the thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid, and the follicle stimulating hormone targets the ovaries and testes, and the luteinizing hormone targets the ovaries and also the testes. Then the prolactin, it targets the breasts. Okay. Then on the other chart, on the other side, it's talking about their effect. So the growth hormone stimulates the body growth in child, causes switch to fats as energy source. Then adrenal cortexes, adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the release of corticosteroid hormones or cortisol or progesterone. Then we talk about the TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the release of the thyroid hormone, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Okay, but when you look at my detailed notes, you'll be able to see that it's more detailed how this process happens and how the mechanism happens and how you can appreciate the information. Now, there's what we call also known as the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. It goes to the ovaries and testes. So FSH stimulates the development of sex cells, ovum, or sperm. So now you should know that a lady is already born with ovum in her ovaries, okay? But as compared to a man, sperms develop continuously throughout his lifetime. Then the luteinizing hormone LH, ovaries and testes. LH stimulates release of hormones known as estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone. All right. Then the prolactin, which goes through the mammary glands, stimulates the production and the release of milk. And also, okay, it's okay. We'll discuss that later. Then when you go to the thyroid gland, all right, remember, this is just an overview. So the thyroid gland produces what we call thyroxine, which is T4 or cells, and stimulates cell metabolism. Then there's what we call triiodothyronine, which is T3 or cells, and stimulates cell metabolism. There's also what we call calcitonone, known for which targets the bones, which stimulates calcium uptake by bones and decreasing blood calcium levels. So this will talk about it under calcium and bone metabolism. Then there's also what we call hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. All right, we'll talk about these phenomena as we go further. So when you talk about hyperthyroidism and hypo, so when hyper has to do with when a person has got a lot of thyroxine being produced, it leads to increase in metabolism. Okay, while hyperthyroidism has to do with low metabolic rate. All right, so because that's under secretion of thyroxine. The other one has to do hyperthyroidism has to do with oversecretion, while hypo has to do with undersecretion, which has got other effects that we are going to discuss later. Now let's go to what we call the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid gland produces what we call the parathyroid hormone, or PTH. It's responsible for bone, intestine, and kidneys. I mean, its target is bone, the intestine, and the kidneys, which stimulates calcium release from bone, calcium uptake from the GI tract, calcium reabsorption in the kidney, and all increasing body blood calcium level. As you know, calcium is very, very important in our body because it helps us, or it helps the muscles to be able to contract and cause a response or cause movement. Okay, so as you know, our GI is made up of smooth muscles. We also have the skeletal muscles, and we also have the heart that needs a lot of calcium for it to continue beating. Now let's go to what we call the thymus gland. So the thymus produces what we call thymosin. We target white blood cells, which has got, or what can say, the primary T lymphocytes, to be more precise. And what does it do? It stimulates reproduction and function development of what we call the T lymphocytes. As you know, we've got T lymphocytes, we've got B lymphocytes, etc., okay? Which you would appreciate if you have learned blood physiology. So now, what you're seeing on the screen is an organ known as the pancreas. So the pancreas, like I said, it has got two functions. It has got endocrine and it has got exocrine. So let's go through the text first. So a combination organ, as they're calling it. So exocrine tissues called acini secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine, all right? And endocrine tissues secrete hormones, and which are responsible for what we call glyconolysis and gluconeogenesis, okay? So now, when you go in detail, you understand that these processes, you learn them under biochemistry. So if you are teaching physiology, you don't talk much about this. You can just talk on the surface because you believe the students already know the information and have appreciated the concepts they learned about these metabolic processes in biochemistry. So this diagram is basically showing the showing the iris of Langerhans or endocrine tissue, which is the ones which are the ductless glands. So we have got about three types. There's there's a delta cell, beta cells, and alpha cells. So these produce different types of chemicals that you can learn about in detail later. So just know that beta cells produce what we call insulin. Then the alpha cells produce what we call glucagon, while the delta cells produce what we call polypeptide hormones and other substances that we are going to talk about later. Okay, then this is the red blood cells in the capillary. Then there's also what we call the pancreatic acini, as you can see, which is known as the exocrine tissue. So the pancreas has got these functions, as you can see. So pancreas produces glucagon. What's the function of glucagon? All cells, particularly in the liver, muscle, and fat. Okay, yeah, that's where it goes. What does it do? Stimulates hepatic glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, increasing blood glucose levels. Then insulin does the opposite. That's just what you can say. All cells, particularly in the liver, muscle. Their target organs are the same, or target tissues are the same, but the function of glucagon is the opposite of insulin, and vice versa. Then there's also what we call somatostatin, which produced by the alpha and beta cells in the pancreas. Okay, but mostly just to be the alpha. Both. Sorry. So somatostatin, again, you would have heard about it being produced in the pits of the gastric pits. Okay, yeah. So now suppresses secretion of glucagon and insulin within the islets of Langerhans. So now when you go to the adrenal glands, as you know, what's the function of the adrenal glands? So the adrenal glands have got two parts. There's what we call the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. Okay, so the adrenal medulla is the inner segment of the adrenal glands and closely tied to the autonomic nervous system, while the adrenal cortex is the outer layer of the endocrine tissue, which secretes steroidal hormones. So now when you go down there, you're going to find that the adrenal medulla, known as epinephrine, okay, or adrenaline, muscle, liver, or cardiovascular system, it stimulates features of the fight or flight response to stress. And just got what we call norepinephrine. There's the muscles, liver, and cardiovascular. That's where they are produced. And what do? It stimulates vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction has to do with making the blood vessels tight or reducing the lumen of the blood vessels. So now, when you talk about the adrenal glands, So adrenal cortex produces, adrenal cortex produces what we call the glucocorticoids or cortisol. Most cells, that's where it targets. What does it do? Stimulates glucagon-like effect, act as anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive agent. All right. Then when we talk about mineralocorticoids or aldosterone, kidneys, blood. So you know about aldosterone has to just go there and target the reabsorption of sodium. Hence, water also does follow in there. I think it's supposed to be in the distal tubules of the nephron. Then there's also what we call androgenic hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. So no wonder you find that in women, you can find women with beards because of this same androgenic hormones such as testosterone. Again, you can be able to find certain feminine features in men because of estrogen and progesterone. So most cells, uterus, and most cells. So see effects under gonad. So these are some of the effects that you can be able to witness. So now the gonads, we have got what we call female ovaries and male testes. So the female ovaries and male testes are also able to produce certain substances. Okay. So now ovaries are able to produce estrogen, right? While testes are able to produce testosterone. So ovaries can produce estrogen and progesterone. So what's the function of estrogen? Most cells, particularly those of the female reproductive tract, stimulates development of secondary sexual characteristics and plays a role in maturation of the egg prior to ovulation. Then progesterone, which is produced, targets the uterus, stimulates uterine changes necessary for successful pregnancy. Then the testes or testosterone, most cells, particularly those of male reproductive tract, and stimulates development of secondary sexual and play a role in development of the sperm cells. All right. So guys, we are going to end here until next time. All right. Thank you very much.